Hey kids, this is an essay from Paresh Chattopadhyay's Socialism and Commodity Production. And this chapter, which is chapter 6, which these are kind of all essays. So chapters, like, you can listen to this on its own. But this chapter is called Anarchist Communism. By and large, communism, at least in Europe, had not been traditionally associated with anarchism. This association was started by some anarchists in the late 1870s, some after the 1871 Paris Commune. It was, quote, collectivism, not communism, with which Bakunin, arguably the best-known anarchist in Europe, had qualified his anarchism. By collectivism, Bakunin meant that the institution of the state must be abolished, that there would not be any individual private property in the means of production, and that all means of production would come under common ownership of the associated producers. Bakunin even showed a totally negative attitude to communism. Thus, at the 1868 Berne Congress of the, quote, League of Peace and Liberty, end quote, he declared, quote, I detest communism because communism is the negation of liberty. I am not a communist because communism concentrates and causes all the forces of society to be absorbed by the state. It necessarily ends in the centralization of property in the hands of the state, while I desire the abolition of the state, which has until now enslaved, oppressed, exploited, and depraved the humans. While I desire the abolition of the state, the radical extirpation of the principle of authority and the tutelage of the state, I desire the organization of society and of collective property from below upwards by means of free association, and not from above downwards. In this sense, I am a collectivist, not a communist, end quote. In this chapter, we treat, that quote was from Kropotkin again. In this chapter, we treat anarchist communism in the writings of two of its foremost representatives, Peter Kropotkin and Carlo Cafiero. New section, Peter Kropotkin. Peter Kropotkin was a scientist, a geographer by training, before he became an anarchist. Kropotkin tried to create a scientific foundation for anarchism in the light of the broad, discernible tendencies in nature and society. The genesis of Kropotkin's anarchism, Kropotkin describes in his 1899 memoirs. Quote, having been brought up in a serf owner's family, I entered active life with a great deal of confidence in the necessity of commanding, ordering, punishing. But when at an early age I had to manage serious enterprises and to deal with men when each mistake would lead at once to heavy consequences, I began to appreciate the difference between acting on the principle of command and discipline and acting on the principle of common understanding. The former works admirably in a military parade, but it is nothing where real life is concerned, and the aim can be achieved only through the serious effort of many converging wills, ... I was prepared to become an anarchist, end quote. Kropotkin. New section. Kropotkin's anarchist communism. According to Kropotkin, anarchism is a principle or theory of life under which society is conceived, quote, without government, end quote, in which the individuals do not have to submit themselves to an authority in order to have a harmonious existence. This is ensured by, quote, free agreements between different groups freely constituted for the sake of production and consumption, as also for the satisfaction of the infinite variety of needs and aspirations of a civilized being. In a society developed on these lines, voluntary associations would take all the fields of human activity so as to substitute themselves for the state in all its functions, end quote. Kropotkin. Footnote. At a philosophical scientific level, Kropotkin viewed anarchism in his 1901 work, Modern Science and Anarchism, as a, quote, world concept based on mechanical explanation of all phenomena, embracing the whole of nature, that is, including in it the life of human societies. Its method of investigation is that of exact natural sciences, and if it pretends to be scientific, every conclusion must be verified by the method by which every scientific conclusion must be verified. Its aim is to construct a synthetic philosophy comprehending, in one generalization, all the phenomena of nature, and therefore also the phenomena of societies, end quote. Kropotkin. End footnote. Such a society cannot come about unless the human mind frees itself from ideas inculcated by, quote, minorities of priests, military chiefs, and judges, all striving to establish their domination, and of scientists paid to perpetuate it, end quote. Kropotkin. A society where there is no longer room for those dominating minorities. The state is only one of the forms of social life which, however, has not existed for all eternity. In his work, The State, Its Historic Role, published in 1897, Kropotkin observes that the Roman Empire was a state, but that the Greek cities and the medieval city republics were not. The state, and particularly the centralized state, re-emerged in Europe rather recently, around the 16th century. And it practically destroyed the free towns and their federations. Footnote. We should point out that in his visceral animosity for anarchism, the eminent Marx scholar Hal Draper has distorted Kropotkin's account of the rise of the modern state. Bracketing Kropotkin with Bakunin, Draper calls him, quote, naive, and derisively writes about Kropotkin's account of the evolution of the state. After quoting Kropotkin to the effect that, quote, the state, as far as Europe is concerned, is of recent origin, it barely goes back to the 16th century, end quote, Draper scornfully writes that the state, quote, apparently did not exist in feudalism. That is, Kropotkin saw the medieval state as non-despotic, hence not a state, end quote. Draper. Also, check out the piece on here from I can't remember what it's called, but it's by Wayne Price. It's called From Shachtmanite Trotskyism to Class Struggle Anarchism, or something like that, or just to Anarchism, by Wayne Price. But he talks about like the very serious problems about like how Draper's like canon that he puts forward of socialism from below people, which he includes Lenin and I believe Trotsky as well in that socialism from below canon. Maybe not. Maybe I'm not exactly sure about Trotsky, but definitely Lenin. And there's definitely something extremely problematic about that. On the other hand, it's important to say as well that I think in one of Paul Maddox's books, Paul Maddox Jr.'s books, he gives Hal Draper's Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, the 5 volumes, like very high praise. Anyway, continuing. First of all, Draper chooses not to mention that, according to Kropotkin, the Roman Empire was already a state which was destroyed by the, quote, barbarians. The modern centralized state starts much later in the 16th century. Thus Kropotkin wrote, quote, in Europe the centralized state dates from the 16th century after the medieval communes were defeated, end quote. It is also remarkable that our Marx scholar did not see that Marx's position on the rise of the modern centralized state, presented in his discourse on the Paris Commune, 1871, is not much different from Kropotkin's. Thus, in both the final version and in the second draft of the discourse, Marx says that the, quote, centralized state power dates from the days of the absolute monarchy serving the nascent middle-class society, end quote. Marx. This, of course, means that under feudalism there was no centralized state in Europe, which is exactly what Kropotkin had written. And yeah, that's the, that's what a lot of people talk about, is like the relative like decentralization of feudalism, right? Yeah. Not that it was an emancipated society, but at least in Europe it was decentralized, which is distinct from feudalism in other places that were a little less centralized, especially societies that were, according to like people like Karl Wittfogel and so on, that were based upon vast systems of irrigation. These like so-called hydraulic societies, which made the state, the centralized state, a little more of a necessary feature of those societies. Anyway, end footnote. Fully recognizing as a fact the equal rights of every member of the society to the wealth accumulated in the past, anarchism refuses to accept a division between the exploited and the exploiters, dominated and the dominators, governed and the governors. Quote, It seeks the most complete development of individuality combined with the highest development of voluntary association in all of voluntary association's aspects, in all possible degrees, ever-changing, ever-modified associations which carry in themselves the elements of their durability and constantly assume new forms which answer best to the multiple aspirations of all." End quote. Kropotkin. In his 1902 work, Mutual Aid, Kropotkin stressed further the character of human society before the rise of the centralized state, as if to refute what was later called, quote, social Darwinism, end quote, that is, the justification of human inequalities on the basis of the survival of the fittest. Kropotkin, basing himself on extant critical historical studies of Europe, including Russia, held that mutual aid among fellow humans had been the rule till very recent times, and had been the foundation of social life. With a remote human origin, this tendency continued to exist and developed further from the tribes through progressively larger agglomerations. A new form of mutual aid appeared in the Middle Ages, a federation of communities covered by a network of fraternities and guilds across the land. Then, towards the end of the 15th century, they fell prey to the growing military state. Quote, only wholesale massacres by the thousands could put a stop to this widely spread popular movement. And it was by the sword, the fire, and the rack that the young states secured their first and decisive victory over the masses of the people. When the medieval cities were subdued in the 16th century by the growing military states, all institutions which had kept the artisan, the master, and the merchant together in the guilds in the cities were violently destroyed. End quote. Kropotkin. You might have heard me talk about in like other recordings that I did about the movie The Devils, which is about the which is like a film adaptation, I believe, of The Devils of Loudun by Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley, excuse me. Whoever did Brave New World. It's Aldous Huxley, right? Yeah. But that book, that movie, if it's a really good movie, if you're curious about it, but it's precisely about this. It's about the centralization of the French state and versus this communal city, Loudun, which is like a walled fortress city, where there was relative peace between like Protestants and Catholics, so the wars of religion didn't quite tear apart the city. At least this is how the movie portrays it. And in order to break the autonomy of this city, they kind of used like this it's kind of like a collective sort of madness amongst certain nuns about as a pretext to accuse the head priest of the city, who was kind of like the acting governor of the mayor of the city, as a witch. So he was persecuted as a witch. And granted, this guy was kind of like unique at his time. I think he was like I said, with like the Protestant and Catholics living peacefully. I think he adopted some unique things. I think he was like technically a Catholic priest, but he had a wife, or at least had female relationships. I think that is definitely true. But anyway, I'm going far too into this. But the centralization of the absolutist French state is kind of like what this film is about, and it's a tremendous piece. It's one of the best, in my opinion. It's one of the best movies ever. Some people might not think so, but I think the Devils by I can't even remember the guy's name, but he's the same guy who made the Tommy, the Who movie, and I can't remember. He made another famous movie. I can't remember it though. But it was good. It has Oliver Reed in it, and ironically for us, it has also Vanessa Redgrave. And I don't know if you know who Vanessa Redgrave is, but she was part of Workers' Revolutionary Party, I think it is, or World Revolutionary Party. I think it's Workers' Revolutionary Party. which is like the kind of like very authoritarian version of British Trotskyism. Jerry Healy ultimately being exposed as a something of a sexual predator, and if not just that, just a sexual abuser. In addition to just being an abuser in general, while having connections with like Gaddafi, like the Libyan government, and fucking being kind of like having a lot of being like a cheerleader for basically Arab authoritarianism in different forms. Accusing Socialist Organizer, which is like the precursor to the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, as being a direct ploy of the Israeli state. Or, yeah. It was a conspiracy. Anyway, back to the text. In his 1901 article, Communism and Anarchy, Kropotkin speaks of two kinds of communism, authoritarian and anarchist. But Kropotkin does not sufficiently clarify what he means by, quote, communism. Kropotkin only cites some historical examples of communitarian life. For example, in Europe's Middle Ages, Kropotkin's criterion of desirability of communism is how far the individual is set free under communism. Quote, of all the institutions and forms of organization that have been tried till now, communism is the one that guarantees the greatest amount of individual liberty, provided that the idea that begets the community be liberty, anarchy, end quote, Kropotkin. Kropotkin adds that, quote, communism, being an economic organization, does not in any way prejudice the amount of liberty guaranteed to the individual, the initiator, the rebel against crystallizing customs, end quote, Kropotkin. Footnote. Kropotkin seems to be unaware that long before him, Marx and Engels, with a very different notion of communism, had stressed in their 1845 German ideology that the organization of communism was essentially economic. We discuss this whole point extensively in another chapter of this book. End footnote. It may be authoritarian or it may be libertarian, opines Kropotkin. Did I say end footnote? It may be authoritarian or it may be libertarian, opines Kropotkin. Then Kropotkin adds, quote, the only durable form of communism is the one in which, following the close contact between fellow humans that it brings, every effort would be made to extend the liberty of the individual in all directions. With anarchy as an aim and as a means, communism becomes possible. Without it, communism necessarily becomes slavery and cannot exist, end quote. Kropotkin. In his 1910 Encyclopedia Britannica contribution, Kropotkin considers anarchists also as, quote, socialists of whom they constitute the left wing, end quote. Further, Kropotkin calls his own anarchism, quote, anarchist communism, end quote. It was Kropotkin's aim to prove that communism had more chances of being established than collectivism, especially in the communes taking the lead, and that, quote, free or anarchist communism is the only form of communism that has any chance of being accepted in civilized societies. Communism and anarchy are, therefore, two terms of evolution which complete each other, the one rendering the other possible and acceptable, end quote. Kropotkin. Footnote. Kropotkin uses the term, quote, collectivism differently from Bakunin, whose usage we have mentioned earlier, and refers to a state socialism that is attributed to Marx. Quote, anarchist communism differed from collectivism only on one point, the way in which the product of labor should be shared. In place of the mutualist and collectivist idea of remuneration, according to hours of labor, the anarchist communists proclaimed the slogan, from each according to his or her means, to each according to his or her needs, end quote. George Woodcock, 1967. End footnote. In fact, in his 1906 work, The Conquest of Bread, Kropotkin wrote, quote, anarchy leads to communism and communism to anarchy, both alike being expressions of the predominant tendency in modern societies, the pursuit of equality, end quote. Mooting the question of distribution, the share of each person in the wealth, Kropotkin observes that it is impossible to estimate the share of a person in the riches which all contribute to a mass. Footnote. It is interesting to note that years before Kropotkin, and in direct opposition to Bakunin, Marx had held that in a communitarian society, communal production is presupposed as the basis of production. The labor of the individual is posited as social labor from the beginning. Here, unlike what happens in commodity production, no ex post recognition of the individual's contribution is necessary. End footnote. From this general synthetic point of view, Kropotkin observes, quote, we cannot hold with the collectivists that payment proportional to the hours of labor rendered by each would be an ideal arrangement, even a step in the right direction. The collectivist ideal appears to be untenable in a society which considers the instruments of labor as a common inheritance. A new form of property requires a new form of remuneration. A new method of production cannot exist side by side with the old form of consumption, any more than it can adapt the old forms of political organization. End quote, Kropotkin. Continuing further with the economic conceptions of the anarchists, Kropotkin holds that the prevailing system of private ownership of land and the capitalist system of production for profit represent a monopoly which goes against the principles of justice and the dictates of utility. They are the main obstacles which prevent the success of modern technology from being brought into the service of all so as to produce general well-being. Quote, the anarchists consider the wage system and capitalist production together as an obstacle to progress, but they also point out that the state was and continues to be the chief instrument for permitting the few to monopolize the land and the capitalists to appropriate for themselves a disproportionate share of the yearly accumulated surplus of production. Consequently, while combating the present monopolization of land and capitalism altogether, the anarchists combat with the same energy the state, the main support of the system, end quote. Kropotkin. As opposed to the collectivists, Kropotkin stresses that to hand over to the state all the main sources of life, the land, the mines, the railways, and so on, as also the management of all the main branches of industry, in addition to all the functions accumulated in the hands of the state, would mean to create a new instrument of tyranny. State capitalism would only increase the powers of bureaucracy and capitalism. True progress lies in decentralization, both functional and territorial, in the development of the spirit of local and personal initiative, and a free federation in lieu of the present hierarchy from center to periphery. Speaking of the process of social transformation, Kropotkin observes that, like all evolution in nature, the slow evolution of society is followed from time to time by periods of accelerated evolution, which are called revolutions. Quote, periods of rapid change will follow the periods of slow evolution, and these periods must be taken advantage of, not for increasing the powers of the state, but for reducing them in every township or commune of the local groups of producers and consumers, as also the regional and eventually the international federations of these groups, end quote. Kropotkin explains that, quote, by, quote, revolution, one should understand that it is not a simple change of governments. It is the taking possession by the people of all social wealth. It is the abolition of all forces which have so long hindered the progress of humanity. However, it is not by any government decree that this revolution, which is basically an immense economic transformation, can be accomplished. In order that the taking possession of society's wealth should become an accomplished fact, it is necessary that the people shake off slavery, to which they have been too much accustomed, that they act on their own will and march forward without waiting for any order from anyone. In his 1892 work on Revolutionary Government, that's the title, Kropotkin wrote that, quote, "The economic change which will result from the social revolution will be so immense, so profound, it must so change all relations based on property and exchange, that it is impossible for any individual to elaborate the different social forms which will spring up in the society of the future. This elaboration of new social forms can only be made by the collective work of the masses. Any authority external to it will only be an obstacle, only a trammel on the organic labor, which must be accomplished," end quote. Kropotkin. In the same work, Kropotkin emphasized that, quote, "It is time to give up the illusion of a revolutionary government. It is time to admit this political axiom that a government cannot be revolutionary," end quote. Kropotkin. In his work, Fields, Factories, and Workshops, published in 1912, Kropotkin takes up the issue of the increasing power of the human over the productive forces of nature. He asks, given the system of division of functions and production for profit, whether the means now in use for satisfying human needs leads to real economy in the expenditure of human forces. Then he mentions several fields of productive activity to illustrate the possibility of achieving economy in the expenditure of human forces. Thus, in agriculture, given well thought out and socially carried out permanent improvements of the soil, the duration of work to grow bread for a family of 5 would be less than a fortnight every year, while the work will be not only far less hard than that of a slave in earlier times, but in fact will be really agreeable, like work in the open air after a day's work in a factory. Kropotkin envisages a great variety of workshops and factories which are needed to satisfy infinite diversity of taste among civilized humans. Quote, "Factories in which human life is more of account than machinery and the making of extra profit, in which men, women, and children will be attracted by the desire of finding an activity suited to their taste, and where, aided by the motor and the machines, they will choose the branch of activity which best suits their inclination," end quote. Finally, we touch on Kropotkin's idea of what Kropotkin considers to be agreeable work for individuals, or in other words, what work becomes possible after society is liberated from the reign of capital. For example, a factory could be made as healthy and pleasant as a scientific laboratory. There can be no doubt that work will become a pleasure and a relaxation in a society of equals, in which, quote, "hands," end quote, will not be compelled to sell themselves and to work under any condition. Slaves can submit to them, but free humans will create new conditions, and their work will be pleasant and infinitely more productive. He stresses, quote, "A society, regenerated by the revolution, will make domestic slavery disappear. This last form of slavery, the most tenacious, because it is also the most ancient. Servant of wife, man can always reckon on woman, servant of or wife, man always reckons on woman to do the housework. But the woman, too, at last claims her share in the emancipation of humanity. She no longer wants to be the beast of burden of the house," end quote. He refers to machines of all kinds which will be introduced into households to enable men and women to work without muscular effort. Quote, "To emancipate woman is to free her from the brutalizing toil of kitchen and washware. Let us fully understand that a revolution intoxicated with the beautiful words liberty, equality, solidarity would not be a revolution if it maintained slavery at home. Half of humanity subjected to slavery of hearth would still have to rebel against the other half," end quote. Kropotkin. New section. Carlo Cafiero. Footnote. The whole section which follows is based on the author's fundamental work on anarchy and communism, delivered as a speech at the Euro Federation of Anarchists in 1880. We should mention here that this same Cafiero had prepared a small popularized compendium of Marx's Capital Volume 1 and had sent it to Marx. Marx, in his reply in French, praised the work, calling it much superior to similar attempts by some others at popularizing his work. The anarchist writers seemed to avoid any mention of this Marx-Cafiero connection. End footnote. By anarchist communism, Cafiero means the revolutionary abolition of the state and wage system. Voluntary association and distribution according to needs. In the existing society, anarchy starts with attack against every authority, every power, every state, whereas in the future society, anarchy will be defense. which means preventing the reestablishment of any authority, any power, any state. The future society will be characterized by, quote, complete liberty of the individual who, freely driven by his, her needs, tastes, and sympathies, will unite with other individuals in an association, free development of the association, which is federated with others in the commune, free development of the communes, which are federated in the regions in the nations in humanity, end quote. Cafiero. Communism is the second term, the first being the term anarchy, of the anarchist revolutionary ideal. Communism today is the taking possession of all wealth existing in the world in the name of humanity. In the future society, communism will signify the enjoyment of all wealth by all individuals following the principle, quote, from each according to one's faculty, to each according to one's needs, that is to say, from each according to one's will, end quote. Cafiero. Cafiero stresses the act of possessing and enjoying society's wealth cannot be mediated by any representative, any government, any state. It must be the act of the people itself directly. And, since the common wealth is spread over the whole globe, since all of it belongs to humanity as a whole, those who find this wealth within their own reach and are in position to use it, will use it in common. Quote, if an inhabitant of Peking came into this country, he or she will have the same right as the others. She would enjoy, in common with the others, all the wealth of the country in the same way that he or she had done in Peking, end quote. Footnote. We have taken the liberty of changing the overtly sexist language of the text. End footnote. Broaching the question of distribution in the new communist society. Broaching the question of distribution in the new communist society, whether individuals will have the right to receive products at will without doing more work, Cafiero answers very positively. The principle, quote, from each according to one's faculty, to each according to one's needs, end quote, is possible because the future communist society will create useful products with such an abundance that there will be no need to limit consumption nor to ask individuals to do more work than they would be able or willing to perform. Cafiero offers 3 reasons for this possibility. 1. Harmony of cooperation in various branches of activity, replacing competitive struggles. 2. Introduction of machines of different kinds on an immense scale. 3. Considerable economy in the power of labor, instruments of labor and raw materials, arising from the suppression of dangerous or useless materials. As regards the first, quote, this individualist principle of capitalist production, each for him, herself against all, and all against each, will be replaced in the future society by the true principle of sociability, each for all and all for each. What an enormous change will be obtained in the results of production, when each man, woman, far from having to struggle against all others, will be helped by them. He or she will have them not as enemies, but as cooperators, end quote. Cafiero. As to the machines, however great their power looks at present, is only minimal compared to what it will be in the future society. One is only to take account of the number of machines remaining idle, because of their inability to earn a profit for the capitalist owner. The workers themselves oppose the machines. Since the machines drive the workers out of the factory, to starve the workers, to crush them. Yet one could imagine what a great interest the workers of the future will have in increasing the number of machines, when workers will not be at the service of the machines. But on the contrary, the machines will be at the service of the workers. Speaking of the possibility of great economies in the process of production, as regards human labor, machines and materials resulting from their proper use, Cafiero underlines, quote, how many workers, how many instruments, how many materials of labor are used today for the armies of land and sea to build ships, fortresses, cannons, and all the arsenals of offensive and defensive weapons. And when all this strength, all these materials, all these instruments are used in industry for the production of articles which be themselves used for production, what a prodigious increase of production we shall see emerge, end quote. Cafiero. With such abundance in communism, each person will be able to receive from the commonwealth whatever is required to satisfy their needs. At the same time, with the hugely diminished labor time due to technological development, work will cease to be a burden on the worker and will be turned into an agreeable endeavor. Now, after putting the instruments of labor and raw materials in common, if society retained the individual distribution of the products of labor, society would be forced to retain money, sharing a greater or lesser accumulation of wealth according to the greater or lesser merit of individuals. Equality would then have disappeared. In the future society, in the beginning, since the products would not be abundant enough, rationing has to be introduced. But in order that the society remain communist, the sharing of products must have to be carried out not according to merit, as it is done under capitalism, but still according to need. Cafiero gives the example of a large family where, though the individuals contribute equally to the common fund according to their earning capacity, each one gets their share according to need, though the helpings are reduced. Quote, "It cannot be otherwise in the great humanitarian family of the future." End quote. Cafiero. New section. Anarchism and Marx, the relation. The conflict in the Workers' First International, the International Workingmen's Association, which existed between 1864 and 1872, between the majority represented by Bakunin and those members who were on his side on the one hand, and Bakunin and his followers on the other, has very much colored the representation of Marx's relation to anarchism. Footnote. Let us just note that Marx's charge against Bakunin in the context of the International had nothing to do with anarchism, but was solely about Bakunin's attempt to turn the International into something totally opposed to the International's basic aim and principles, to turn the body into a headquarters of world revolution by conspiratorial means. This is confirmed by a great historian of anarchism, who is also its sympathizer, Peter Marshall, in a book praised by Noam Chomsky. Marshall writes, quote, "It is difficult to refute the main thrust of the, quote, Marxist camp," end quote. Bakunin undoubtedly tried to establish a secret, centralized, hierarchical organization with the intention of directing the International. End quote. End footnote. In the following, we will abstract from the events connected with this conflict and stay most exclusively within the realm of ideas. In this question, the focus is, given the anarchist absolute opposition to the state, mainly on the relation of the state to socialism as Marx saw it. The first thing that comes to mind in this connection is that the position ascribed to Marx on this issue, that the state is an integral part of socialism, is ascribed, however paradoxically, by both of the two opposing political sides, anarchists and a large section of Marx's own followers, particularly the partisans of what after 1917 passes for socialist regimes. This ascribed position, completely alien to Marx, enabled the anarchists in general to make an impermissible amalgam of Marx's position and the position of the, quote, Marxists, Marxians, obfuscating Marx's own position on both state and socialism. Footnote. Maximilien Rubel, arguably the most informed Marx scholar after David Ryazanov. I have David Ryazanov's introduction to Karl Marx and multiple texts by Maximilien Rubel on this channel. Anyway, Maximilien Rubel arguably the most informed Marx scholar after David Ryazanov, has observed that, quote, Marxism as the ideology of the master class succeeded in emptying the concepts of socialism and communism, as Marx and his forerunners understood them, of their original meaning, and has replaced it with a picture of reality, which is its complete negation, end quote. Rubel. Again, the same writer stresses the peculiar fact that, quote, the triumph of, quote, Marxism, end quote, as a state doctrine and party ideology preceded by several decades the publication of the writings where Marx set out most clearly and completely the scientific basis of his social theory, end quote. Rubel. This, quote, anachronism, end quote, added Rubel, quote, has an analogy uniquely in the genesis of great religions, where faith precedes canonization, end quote. End footnote. Where am I? However, though the question of the state in relation to the society after capital has been the primary focus in the controversy, a few Marxians have also critically discussed some other aspects of anarchism from the point of view of what they consider to be Marx's own perspective. Given the somewhat extended analysis of the topic of the state in relation to socialism in another chapter in this book, we try here to deal with that part of the supposedly, quote, Marxian critique, which touches on the non-state aspects of the discussion. One of the few Marxians who have criticized the anarchist on both points, state as well as non-state, is Nikolai Bukharin. This mainly concerns the economic organization of the society succeeding capital. Let us first summarize Bukharin's arguments on this question. On the one hand, Bukharin holds that, for the communists, it is centralized production under large trusts, while on the other, for the anarchists, it is small decentralized production. Further, the communists believe not only that the society of the future must free itself of the exploitation of human by human, but also that it will have to ensure for the human the greatest possible independence from nature that surrounds her/him, that it will reduce to a minimum the time spent on socially necessary labor, developing to a maximum the forces of production and likewise the productivity itself of social labor. Communists consider that the ideal solution to this is centralized production, methodically organized in large units. The anarchists, on the other hand, prefer a totally different type of relations of production. Their ideal consists of tiny communes, which by their very structure are disqualified from managing any large enterprises, but reach, quote, agreements, end quote, with one another and link up through the network of free contracts. Just as a side note real quick, I have a piece coming up that's on the channel. don't even remember who it's by. It might be by Makhno, or it might be by Volin. I'm not sure. I feel like it's from one of those. It's from some Russian or Ukrainian anarchist. Oh no, it's I think it's Lucio Fabri, Anarchism and, quote, Scientific Communism, which is from Bloodstained 100 Years of Leninist Counter-Revolution. So that's what I'm thinking of here. Sorry. Where am I? This is still Bukharin speaking. Their ideas consist of tiny communes, which by their very structure are disqualified from managing any large enterprises, but reach, quote, agreements, end quote, with one another and link up through a network of free contracts. From an economic point of view, that sort of production is closer to the medieval communes than to the mode of production destined to supplant the capitalist system. This system is not only a retrograde step, it is also utterly utopian. Any new order is possible and useful only insofar as it leads to the further development of the productive forces of the order which is destined to disappear. Naturally, any further development is conceivable as a continuation of the tendency of the productive forces of centralization. Seeing that capitalist centralization is a method of oppression, the anarchists protest, in their simplicity, against all centralization of production. Their infantile naivety confuses the essence of the thing with its social historical forms. Then Bukharin concludes, quote, so the distinction between communists and anarchists with respect to the bourgeois society lies not in what we favor, in that we favor the state and they are against the state. Wait, so maybe that what I was reading earlier wasn't Bukharin, a quote. I thought it was a quote, sorry. It was just Paresh Chattopadhyay summarizing Nikolai Bukharin on anarchism. Then Bukharin concludes, quote, so the distinction between communists and anarchists with respect to the bourgeois society lies not in what we favor, that we favor the state and they are against the state, but rather in that we favor production being centralized in large units, fitted to the maximum development of productive forces, while anarchists favor small decentralized production which cannot raise but only lower the level of these productive forces, end quote. Bukharin. This account of the anarchist position by Bukharin has to be taken with a tablespoon of salt. It is an oversimplified representation and to a large extent a misrepresentation of the anarchist, particularly of the, quote, anarchist communist, end quote, position on the question of the economic organization of the society after capital. Remarkably, Bukharin does not give any specific reference to any particular text by the anarchists in his critique of their position. As can be seen in our discussion given above on the positions of the two anarchist communists, Kropotkin and Cafiero, with reference to their text, Bukharin's description of the alleged defects of the anarchist position on the organization of production in the society after capital is highly inaccurate. Kropotkin, we know, stresses the necessity of countless variety of factories in order to satisfy an infinite diversity of taste. They are also needed to increase the power of humans over the productive forces of nature, enabling real economy in the expenditure of human labor power. Marx had already stressed the importance of machinery for gaining the, quote, economy of time, end quote. Similarly, Kropotkin emphasizes the necessity of, quote, modern technology, end quote, for producing general well-being. Naturally, the scale of production would correspond to the technology applied. In the same way, we saw that another anarchist communist, Cafiero, had spoken of the introduction of machines of different kinds, quote, on an immense scale, end quote. As to the machines, their power under capitalism looks minimal compared to what it will be in the future society, where workers will not be at the service of the machines, but the machines will be at the service of the workers. For those familiar with Marx's text, this immediately brings to mind Marx's own position. Technology will, quote, hugely diminish, end quote, the amount of working time. Finally, the federative communal structure of the organization in society, championed by the anarchist communists, is only a version of what the 1871 communards had planned for France. It also touched precisely the organization of industry. Engels, in his introduction to Marx's Civil War in France, wrote that, quote, the organization of large-scale industry was not only to be based on the association of the workers in each factory, but also to combine all these associations in one great union, which, in short, as Marx quite rightly says, must have led to the end of communism. Must have led in the end to communism. End quote. That's very interesting. I want to reread that. It also touched precisely the organization of industry. Engels, in his introduction to Marx's Civil War in France, wrote that the, quote, organization of large-scale industry was not only to be based on the association of the workers in each factory, but also to combine all these associations in one great union, which in short, as Marx quite rightly says, must have led in the end to communism, end quote. The irony is that, very interestingly, Engels observed on the same page of his work that this scheme was the work of Proudhon. The anarchist, while adding that the end of the process, that is, communism, was the, quote, direct opposite of the Proudhon doctrine, end quote. Going beyond these specific charges against the anarchists, Bukharin also undertakes a wholesale damnation and dismissal of anarchism without, again, referring to any particular text in the relevant literature. Bukharin, in the text under consideration here, opines that it follows from the anarchist theory that the quote, consistent anarchist must be averse to Soviet power and fight against it, end quote. That, quote, anarchists cannot have any special affection for the Soviets, end quote. And that, quote, at best they merely exploit the Soviets and are ever ready to dismantle them, end quote. It is indeed ironical that the very year that Bukharin denounced the anarchists as the enemies of the Soviets also saw the end of the Soviets as independent organs of power of the laboring people of Russia. Bukharin himself, as a leading member of the conquering group and not the anarchists, was a party to this liquidation of the Soviets. Footnote. In the footnote accompanying Bukharin's text we read, quote, the Italian editors note that the author was referring to what happened in Russia, end quote. End footnote. Quote, anarchy, continued Bukharin, quote, is the ideology not of the proletariat, but of D-class groups lacking a connection with all productive labor, ideology of the lumpen proletariat, ruined bourgeoisie, decadent intellectuals, peasants cast out of their families, and impoverished, an amalgam of people incapable of creating anything new, end quote, Bukharin. Not a word on how Bukharin arrived at this conclusion, on what evidence. Now, if we follow the logic of facts, and not the argument of abuse and vituperation soaked in ideology, and read the work of the eminent American historian of anarchism, Paul Avrich, I have a piece by Paul Avrich on this channel, particularly his work on the role of the Russian anarchists in the 1917 revolution in Russia, we get a very different picture of the anarchists. Far from being a bunch of idlers, delinquents, and lumpen proletarians, incapable of creating anything new, the anarchists showed themselves to be the most energetic participants in the revolution at the side of the Bolsheviks. Just a side note, one of the more recent compendiums about that's like an like a companion to the Russian Revolution, put together by Jeffrey Swain, I think it was the editor, important historian of the Russian Revolution. He says, not him, but like in the book, there's an article on anarchists in the Russian Revolution, and he's basically says, like, I think the title is something like Anarchist, the Manual Laborers of the Revolution, or something like that. So that, I mean, I don't know what that actually, I don't know if I'm even saying the title right, or what that means in the context of the entry, the chapter in that book, but I think it jives very well with what is being said here, being relayed here about Avrich's analysis. Anyway, far from being a bunch of idlers, delinquents, and lumpen proletarians incapable of creating anything new, the anarchists showed themselves to be the most energetic participants in the revolution at the side of the Bolsheviks. The anarchists were greatly impressed by Lenin's ultra-radical statements of April 1917. Avrich writes that, quote, Lenin's appeal for a, quote, breakup and a revolution 1,000 times more powerful than that of February, end quote, had a distinctively Bakuninist ring, end quote. And then Avrich quotes, quote, a prominent anarchist, end quote, that, quote, there existed a perfect parallelism between the two groups, end quote. Avrich. There were at least 4 anarchist members of the, quote, Bolshevik-dominated military committee which organized the seizure of power on the 25th of October 1917, end quote. With the overthrow of the provisional government, quote, the marriage of convenience between the Bolsheviks and the anarchists had accomplished its purpose, end quote. Avrich. However, by the spring of 1918, the majority of anarchists became sufficiently disillusioned with Lenin to seek a complete break, while the Bolsheviks, for their part, had begun to contemplate the suppression of their former allies, who had outlived their usefulness and whose incessant criticisms were a nuisance, and the new regime no longer had to tolerate. Who outlived their usefulness and whose incessant criticisms were a nuisance, the new regime no longer had to tolerate. An open break occurred in April 1918 when the Cheka launched a campaign to remove those anarchist cells considered particularly dangerous from Moscow and Petrograd. The anarchists cried out in protest that the Bolsheviks had betrayed the masses in the revolution. We should remember that Bukharin's vituperative attack on the anarchists occurred during just this period. Quote, but if the golden age was slipping from their grasp, the anarchists refused to despair. They tenaciously clung to the belief that ultimately their vision of a stateless utopia would triumph. They proclaimed, quote, the revolution is dead, long live the revolution, end quote. Avrich. Or end quote, Avrich. Let us, for a change, take the anti-anarchist attack of a Marxist of a more recent vintage, the eminent scholar Hal Draper, obsessed with Bakunin, out to demolish the, quote, Marx anarchist myth, end quote. Draper presents anarchism almost as a generalization of Bakuninism, ignoring the different tendencies within anarchism. Draper refers to Marx's designation of the 1871 commune as a, quote, workers' government, a representative government based on universal suffrage, end quote, and then adds that, quote, both these institutions, end quote, were, quote, and anathema to any anarchist who knew what he was talking about, end quote. Here is a counterexample. An eminent anarchist, a junior contemporary of Kropotkin, José Jonas Pujols, in his 1882 essay on, quote, "What is Anarchy?" stressed that, quote, "Administration is the only thing required and indispensable in any civilized society," end quote. Pujols. Here, obviously, quote, "administration" signifies governance. Pujols continued, quote, "Since a collective as a whole cannot write a letter or do an infinity of tasks which only individuals can perform, it follows that delegating these tasks to the most qualified person, subject to a code of conduct prescribed in advance, is not only an abdication of freedom, but rather an accomplishment of the most sacred duty of anarchy, which is the organization of administration." The organization of administration, end quote. Pujols stressed that, quote, "all commissions or delegations appointed in an anarchist society should at all times be liable to replacement and recall through ongoing balloting of the section or sections by which they have been elected," end quote. Just as many anarchists affected by what happened in the International have misrepresented Marx's mainly political ideas, the Marxians also, particularly those in the Bolshevik tradition, have misrepresented the ideas of the anarchists. In fact, a close reading of the literature on anarchism shows that the anarchist stand that Marx was a statist draws mainly not so much on what Marx himself wrote in his own text as on what the, quote, Marxists, end quote, said on this question, claiming Marx's authority, not always strictly following his text. Here an important role in this regard was also played by the political practice of the 20th century, quote, socialist regimes. We take up this question of Marx's position on the state in some detail in another chapter. It's important, though, however, that a lot of these criticisms, I want to say, though, the negative criticisms of anarchism and anarchist criticisms of Marxism did have pre-existed the rise of Bolshevism as an international movement. I don't know what the meaning of that is, but, you could, I'm pretty sure there's pretty negative. Most of Rosa Luxemburg's commentary on anarchism is pretty negative. So is, I'm pretty sure, so is Kautsky's. Actually, I'm guessing about Kautsky. But I think, the idea of, what was I going to say? The idea, but I think Paresh Chattopadhyay is correct to say that this gulf widened tremendously after the October Revolution. It may not be totally out of place here if we present a couple of rather unusual statements from Bakunin in praise of Marx. The anarchist authors rarely mention these statements, and they seem to be mostly unknown to the Marxians, though these statements do not specifically refer to the question of the state. The first statement was pronounced in Bakunin's address to the Berna Congress of the, quote, League of Peace and Liberty, 1869, where he compared Proudhon with Marx. Quote, "Proudhon, in spite of all his efforts to get a firm foothold on the ground of reality, remained an idealist and a metaphysician. Proudhon's starting point is the abstract side of law from which he arrives at economic facts, while Marx, on the contrary, has enunciated and proved the truth, demonstrated by the whole of ancient and modern history of the human societies, of peoples and of states. The economic facts precede the facts of political and civil law. This discovery and demonstration of this truth is one of the greatest merits of Mr. Marx," end quote. Bakunin. The second statement appeared in a pamphlet that he composed during 1869 to 71, in which he called Das Kapital a, quote, magnificent work. In continuation, he wrote, Quote, nothing that I know of contains an analysis so profound, so luminous, so scientific, so decisive. Quote, nothing that I know of contains an analysis so profound, so luminous, so scientific, so decisive, so merciless an expose of the formation of bourgeois capital and the systematic and cruel exploitation capital continues exercising over the work of the proletariat. The only defect of this work, based on a profound study of economic works, without admitting any logic other than the logic of facts, the only defect is that it has been written in part, and in part only in a style excessively metaphysical and abstract, which makes it difficult to explain, and nearly unapproachable for the majority of workers, and it's principally the workers who must read it nevertheless. The bourgeois will not read it. This work is nothing other than a sentence of death, scientifically motivated and irrevocably pronounced, not against the bourgeoisie as individuals, but against their class. End quote. Let us conclude here by referring to some interesting remarks by Roberto Michels, the Italianized German sociologist, on what he thought was a confluence of the two systems, Bakunin's and Marx's, here put in a nutshell by a contemporary author. Quote, Marxism and Bakuninism functioned as two intimately related systems of radical thought. Both began as an obliterating indictment of capitalism, but then sought the same socialist ends, though by different means. One should not skip over the differences, but the conventional wisdom about Bakuninism and Marxism skipped over the similarities. Marxism entered the mentality of Italian socialists through Bakunin. In Michel's telling of the history of Italian socialism, this quote isn't from Michel's. I thought it was, but it says actually by a contemporary author. In Michel's telling of the history of Italian socialism, Bakunin appears as a kind of John the Baptist, preparing the way for the gospel of Marxism. Quote, one can say that the Italian workers, saturated with Bakunin's ideas, were then psychologically prepared to receive the ideas of Marx. End quote. End quote. Drake. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.